Hi, Dr. Amy. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to be here, Meg.
Well, I am excited to dive into all of this. But before we get started, could you just give us a little bit of background on who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Oh my goodness. Who I am. So I'm a medical physician, and that's part of my story of how I came to be working on trauma, for goodness sakes. How did that happen? So I'm actually board certified in preventive medicine and addiction medicine, and started my training in general surgery, though. Did 3.5 years of residency in general surgery. And I adopted my son, Miguel, while I was in medical school at Loma Linda University. And that got me very deep into trauma work because it was in my home. And through that process, my goodness, I learned so much. And more importantly, Meg, I would say that I learned what I needed to unlearn from what I thought I knew about the body, and to really understanding what does it take to heal trauma. And then when I was in surgery residency, I then had my own health crash and realized that all the symptoms that I was having were all related to early childhood stress and trauma. And yet I'm looking back at my childhood, it's nothing like that of Miguel's, nothing. And so I did not understand why I would be having these same physical health symptoms, conditions, as other people who had had a very stressful childhood, a very traumatic childhood, because that's not what I saw when I looked back at my childhood. And so it was this, again, a redefining moment for me of, oh my goodness, I guess I don't understand trauma because I'm missing a big piece. And that started me on my own search and journey and figuring out, is it even possible to rewire trauma patterns as an adult? I didn't know if that was possible, but that was the journey that I got started on. And then it became just my life. And now I share that with other people. And it's been very helpful for other people. So I continue to share my own journey and what I've learned and continue to learn about my own system and my own work, and be able to help people along their journey as well.
Well, that's wonderful. And I love your perspective because you have the perspective of the physician, the physical, the biological understanding. And I think sometimes people think like, okay, this is on one side, the releasing trauma and the healing, and then we have the biology and all of this on the other side. So I love how you have that knowledge to bring those both together to really put it together. So that's great. Well, let's start talking a little bit about the difference between what is stress and what is actually trauma.
Oh, I love that, Meg, because that was what happened to me. So I experienced burnout in my residency. At least that's what I was told that I had. Right? Like, oh, Amy, like you are burned out. And we call burnout chronic stress. And so here I was being labeled or diagnosed with chronic stress and being told that I needed to do stress management and yoga and therapy and all these things that we tell people to do for chronic stress and burnout. And yet, what I realized along my own journey was, wait a second, I'm not dealing with chronic stress here. I'm dealing with trauma responses in my body that are still happening, still being triggered. And that's what I see happening to so many other people now as well, is that they're being told that they have chronic stress. Maybe they're also being told that they have burnout. And so they're being given the wrong prescription because they're being given a prescription for chronic stress when actually they need to be given a prescription for trauma responses still happening in their body. So knowing the difference between stress and trauma is actually a really important thing for people to know. And when people know that, then they are empowered in their conversations with their physicians or their other providers because they know what's going on in their body, and they're not going to be misled with information that still just hasn't reached a lot of the medical providers. So the difference between stress and trauma, the we have a stress response in our body and we have a trauma response in our body, and they are two very different things, though the trauma response always does go through the stress response. And so when we think of a danger, when we think of anything that gets us scared or activated, if we want to use that word, it always starts with this initial startle response, which is that kind of like uh-oh moment, right? Like, uh-oh, what was that sound? Oh, what is this email going to say? Oh, what are they going to say next? There's always that initial uh-oh moment, and that's the startle response. And so that takes us wherever we are, and it just takes us a little higher up that level of energy. And all of our senses get tuned in now to hyper focus on this potential danger. And then what happens next is that our body will go into a stress response if we perceive that to be a real danger. So if it was just, oh, my kid accidentally dropped the cup on the floor. Okay, not a big problem. Versus no, like this is a big problem. And so then at that point, our body goes into a stress response, and that's an even higher energy level. And so if you think even of the animal kingdom, right? And there's that startle moment where a deer, like their ears will go up because they think they heard a sound. And that's their startle response. And we have that startle response. But then they're like, oh no, there's a mountain lion there and I need to start running. That's now their stress response. And so our stress response, we can recognize that because it's a very high energy state. It's when we have adrenaline that's pumping through our blood. It's when we are fully mobilized. And by mobilized, I mean we are also in movement. We are taking action. Because of our biology, it's impossible for us not to take action. So that if at any point we find ourselves not taking action, we are actually in a trauma response. We're no longer in that stress response. And so anytime that we go into that, whoa, this is too big of a problem. I don't think that I'm big enough. I don't think that I'm strong enough. I don't think that I have enough resources, whether that's financial resources or emotional resources or energy resources, whatever it is, in that moment that problem seems so much bigger than us, we actually stop moving and we go into a freeze response. Now, a freeze response does not mean that you are standing there frozen. It can for some people, but it means that you feel your energy drop. It's when you feel that collapse of your energy and you may find yourself thinking thoughts of, this is too much. This is too big. I can't do this. I can't do this anymore. Those are the thoughts that a person would know, oh, like my system has just dropped from that stress response, which is, I'm going to do this. I'm going to tackle this problem. I'm going to figure this out. That's the stress response to, I can't. This is too much. And that's that energy drop, which is the trauma response. And so then we have that initial response of that freeze and that energy drop. And then our body kind of goes and settles in at the very bottom of our energy level. And that's where the trauma response just kind of plays itself out, and it starts to shut down our body, starts to shut down our energy, starts to shut down our digestive system, causes inflammation. It causes all of these downstream effects on our biology, which is then another way in which we can actually recognize, oh, like my body's actually having an active trauma response based on my physical health, not just my emotional or my mental health. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, so when I have a question about that in relation to cortisol, because we know a lot of times in that fight or flight, then you're in that sympathetic nervous system response, you're high cortisol generally. And then whenever you get more, where you get more of that, we just call like adrenal fatigue, you start to get that depleted, everything feels overwhelming. Would that play a role? Does that have any factor in the stress to trauma like continuum?
Ooh, I like that question. That's a great question. So, and this is a very commonly misunderstood thing, even in functional medicine circles still. So, after adrenaline, you will get a outburst of cortisol. And so the adrenal gland is there to support the stress response with cortisol. The purpose of cortisol is actually to support the stress response, is to support the high energy response, is to support you being able to take action with the problems in your life and to protect your body and your brain from the what could be damaging effects of the adrenaline itself. So the adrenaline is the initial, oh my goodness, like we need a lot of energy to move. And so we've got that adrenaline wave that hits us, but then the cortisol comes through, and it is to kind of dampen the effects of the adrenaline because it can be more damaging to our tissues. And it maintains us in that stress response. So if we were driving a car, it would be the equivalent of that initial, like, all the way accelerator with adrenaline. And then the cortisol comes in and says, all right, we don't need it all the way, but we're going to keep it at 3/4. But our foot is on the accelerator and we are still accelerating. We are still in that high energy state. Now, what happens with the trauma response, it would be the equivalent of keeping your foot on the gas pedal, but now also pulling the emergency brake on, which is why it results in very confusing messages to our body. Because wait a second, the gas is still on. I still have cortisol, but yet I'm also having this overriding program message come through that says, no, we're shutting this thing down. And so with our emergency brake on, our body does shut down, and that's all communicated through the vagus nerve, specifically the dorsal nucleus of the vagus nerve, and it will overpower that sympathetic response. But the sympathetic response is still on, Meg. Like that's part of the downstream effects on our biology, is that sympathetic response is still on. And so people can look at their cortisol levels, for example, and be like, but my cortisol is high. And I'm like, but that doesn't mean that you're still in the stress response, because that emergency brake is more powerful than the accelerator, just like in a car.
Wow, that's fascinating. And there's a lot of dynamics that are, yeah, and being pulled, being, you can see that analogy that you gave. That's a good analogy because it's like you're pulled in, like here I am, I'm stressed, I'm going, but it feels so overwhelming. So to recognize a trauma response, you're going to get more of that overwhelmed feeling that you can't handle it.
Regardless of your cortisol levels.
Okay.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
wow.
And that's for me, like part of the exciting thing is like, we have other ways to measure the trauma response other than just labs.
Okay.
And so if a person is in that adrenal fatigue where their cortisol levels are now chronically low, that just means that they are further down this progression of that trauma response running the program of their body. Initially, if they're further upstream in the process, their body is still very much going into the sympathetic and that trauma response with the emergency brake, but their cortisol levels can still be high.
Mm-hmm.
But as they continue down this path, as the trauma response continues to play out and becomes the dominant program that their body operates from, they will reach a point where that cortisol is getting lower and lower, and then even dipping down into low cortisol levels, what other people would call adrenal
Yeah,
fatigue.
I just
And
use
yet,
that. I know, like that's a loose term, but people like relate to
but
that.
it's so helpful because people do have usually have heard that term. And so now to be able to see it through the lens of the biology of trauma and be like, no, this is just chronic trauma. This is that trauma response in your body that has been playing out for decades, that it is now this far down that progression.
That's great. What, and you also mentioned past trauma. So like now we have trauma where we're in this response and we're going through it, but we also hold on to past trauma. So how do you recognize past trauma and kind of how that plays out?
Yeah, another great question, because most of our physical health, the chronic conditions make. So the chronic conditions and chronic symptoms that we have are all past traumas. They're all past traumas. Now, when we experience a flare up of those symptoms, that's something that has just happened in the moment. And whether that is a real danger or that's just a perceived danger, right? Where now we have made up stories in our head of what's dangerous and what's not in the world. And again, the further along that our body gets in this running the program of trauma in our biology, the more time it will spend in that trauma response. We call it the dorsal vagal response, if people are familiar with the polyvagal theory. And so it's this programming that is run through the vagus nerve that communicates we are an active threat, not just threat, but overwhelming threat that is bigger than us all the time. And so it keeps us in that state where it is shutting down our metabolism. It's shutting down our digestive system. It's causing inflammation. And this is kind of becoming our normal biology. So those chronic conditions are all as a result of past life experiences that overwhelmed us. And over time, they've just become more and more our programming, so that now we have acute symptoms on top of chronic symptoms. And so every day, many people are going into that trauma response or feeling overwhelmed by their daily life. And those would be acute trauma responses. And it's layered on top of chronic trauma responses that have just become their baseline for how they run every day of their life and how their biology is running every day.
Wow. Yeah, and it's overwhelming. So so let's move on to a little bit of what people can actually start to do.
Yeah. So when we are working with the trauma response, there is a very specific sequence in which people need to work on things in order to have the body shift out of that trauma response programming. It's like having the software programming in your computer that you need to change the software programming. The hardware is fine. It's just the software programming that it's running is not working for us. And so how we change that software programming is a very specific sequence. The first thing that we have to bring in is safety. And so safety, both in a felt sense of safety, but also changing our biology to a biology of safety rather than a biology of threat. And so there are a couple different things that we do that when we do them together, it's like magic, and they become synergistic and they complement each other. And we actually can accomplish a lot and a lot faster when we do them together. So I bring in the somatic work, somatic experiencing. People may or may not be familiar with that term. And it's actually working with your own body, becoming aware of your nervous system, learning how to track your nervous system, learning how to actually recognize in the moment based on your own body sensations. Am I in stress response or am I in that overwhelm and trauma response? Where am I right now? And then being able to use some gentle tools to shift their state in that moment more towards a parasympathetic state, which is that social engagement. I feel safe. I feel secure. All is well. I am okay. And slowly over time, what they're doing is that they're creating different experiences for their body, experiences of safety. Because what has happened is that for many of us, we have gotten so used to living in our heads that we think about everything. We run our life by analyzing everything. And we actually don't even know how to notice and track our own system, let alone manage and shift our own system. It's kind of like learning how to shift the gears in your car, right? Like if you don't know how to do that, you're kind of at the mercy of whatever happens. But you learning how to shift the gears in your car, it allows you to drive a completely different way. And it allows you to be in control of how you drive your car. And so when we become the experts at our own system and learn how to track and shift our own nervous system, it opens up so much. But how we got into these trauma patterns is from the loss of safety and the loss of a felt sense of safety. And we got there by an experience in life feeling like it was too much, too fast. Well, that's a loss of safety if something is too much, too fast, or we've been living on too little of something that we need for just too long. And again, there's that loss of safety of, I don't know how much longer I can go without love, without touch, without support, without whatever it is that we need. I don't know how much longer I can go. And there again is that loss of safety. I don't know if I will be okay. And when we start to bring in that safety is what the trauma response needs. And so we bring in safety. The other thing that it needs is energy. And so with that trauma response, again, we've gone into a low metabolic state. So even our mitochondria have shut down. We are conserving energy because we don't know if we're going to have enough energy to get through. We don't know. And so we better not lose any energy. And everything becomes hard then. Everything feels hard in our day. And everything needs to be easy, because if anything happens that we weren't expecting, then it's like, oh no, I don't have the energy for you. I don't have the energy. I don't have the energy to make decisions. I don't have the energy to pick that thing up off the floor. I just don't feel like I have any extra energy. And so the other thing that the freeze response needs is energy. And when we can start to create those moments of felt safety where you truly feel safe in your body, it's not something that your mind is telling you that you should feel safe, Meg. Meg, you should feel safe. You are safe, so you should
Yes.
feel safe. But it's actually a felt sense of no, like my body is informing me that I am safe. Like it's my body that's actually telling my mind I am safe rather than my mind trying to convince my body that I am safe. We start to create those moments of felt safety. We bring in energy. And then with time, that trauma response starts to lose its power, lose its programming because it actually has everything that it needs. So that's always the first step. Then we can talk about the stress response and what it needs, because when we come out of that chronic trauma response, our body's going to go back into the stress response
Yeah.
where it was before the trauma response. And that needs a felt sense of support. And then as we give that a felt sense of support, now we can actually step into what we call expansion. And this expansion includes joy, it includes healthy boundaries, it includes being present, fully present. It actually includes being able to process trauma and doing other forms of therapy. We actually can't do effective therapy until we feel safe, until we have that felt sense of support. And again, that's where a lot of people go wrong because they're trying to accomplish that felt sense of safety with therapy, not realizing that no, like you actually need to have those tools before you go into therapy for it not to re-traumatize you and put your body back into a trauma response. So that essential sequence to addressing chronic trauma is safety, along with energy, safety, support, and then expansion. And when we bring in the biology along with the somatic work, then also some parts work to work with the belief systems that we've had, it's just that magic effect that they complement each other. And I've seen people make tremendous progress, even after decades of having tried so many other things and them not having the results, not having the change that they really wanted to see in their life.
And that is so I hear you because it's so frustrating when you've been dealing with things for a long time and you can lose the like actually and part of what you're saying is the even the belief. You can even lose that belief because nothing's worked and you've tried over and over and you feel like, okay, you know what, I'm going through the motions, I'll do it, but I'm not going to actually feel better. So for them to be able to see that, that's really tremendous. And you mentioned something at the beginning when you were talking about yourself that I do find as interesting because I think the word trauma in itself is a big word to us. So you were saying how you feel that like you weren't you like okay, I had a nice childhood, I had loving parents, let's say I lived in a but I didn't have trauma, but you really found that you did, and we all have trauma in some way. So do you feel sort of this discrepancy in what people really how they feel about that word or what they label as trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of what we need to redefine. So we need to redefine trauma because people are still looking at trauma as, oh, that big event,
Mhm.
that big thing that happened. Or even some people will talk about the little T traumas, oh, those little things that just added up over time. And yet, even that, we're still looking at an event. We're still looking at something that happened. Whereas the real trauma is the experience of the body. It's not about the actual event itself. And it's the experience of the body of being overwhelmed that, for whatever reason, at that time overwhelmed us. And so two people can literally go through the exact same experience, exact same event. And one come out being like, whew, that was stressful, but I'm glad I got through that. And another person traumatized. And it seems to stay with them and they continue to have triggers about it. And they seem to still be affected by it later in life. Why? I mean, it was the same event, it was the same experience. It was because what was the experience of their body? One person, it didn't overwhelm them. It was stressed them, but it didn't overwhelm them. And for the other person, no, that overwhelmed them for whatever reason, whether it was because of other things that were going on in their life, or it was things that were happening in their own internal environment, their body, for example. Maybe they already had some inflammation. Maybe they already had some mitochondrial compromises. Maybe they already had these things that were pushing them closer to that line of overwhelm, so that then when that thing happened, it just was what pushed them over the line. So it really is not as much to do about the external circumstances as it is our internal state, and the internal state that we go into an experience with, so that then what is the net effect of that experience on our body.
Mhm. Yeah, and I always say that even before trauma, even about stress. I mean, your body's responding to your perceived stress, not actually what's going on. So it does empower you when you can control. Like these are really important things, everyone, because when you can control those responses and have your own power within it, then it can change just how your body's responding to everything.
Yeah.
Do you find that certain biologies really respond to, like, as physically respond to this trauma differently?
Well, that's a great question. So what I have found is that there are different biologies that will actually predispose someone to then being overwhelmed in a life experience. And some of these are genetics, some of these are epigenetics, some of these are exposures that you've had in your lifetime that became stressors for your system, or even neurotoxins that created already a trauma threat response in your nervous system. But when we have those at our baseline, then we're more vulnerable going into an experience. Our biology is more sensitive. And so it doesn't take as much then to reach that point of overwhelm as someone else who has a biology that is well resourced. And we're talking about biology now on a cellular level. And I think that's really important for people to understand that so much of what we've been taught about trauma is that it's a head thing, it's a brain thing, it's your amygdala, it's your limbic system, it's all of that, which it does include that. But where is the amygdala and the limbic system getting their messages? They're getting their messages from our body down at the cellular level of, hey, this is how resourced we are, this is how much energy we have, this is how much magnesium we have, this is the sensitivity or the reactivity of our nervous system based on how much zinc we have, for example. And so all of these messages are coming up from our cells, informing our nervous system, including our brain, how much stress we can hold before it becomes overwhelming. And so our body is actually what pulls that trigger for pulling on the emergency brake. It's not our brain, it's our body. And so that's why, even though this was something that I struggled with, because I was definitely one who much prefers to live in my head, give me a book to read rather than a guided, exercise to do with my body. But learning how to read the states of my nervous system and then being able to shift that, connecting with the body, is what allows us to shift this trauma response, and being able to inform the body that we are safe. And then the body informs the brain, hey, we're safe, we're doing good, we can hold this stress, we don't need to go into the overwhelm, because it literally can actually become a habit. And when we've had biology that predisposes us to being overwhelmed by things, for example, maybe your detoxification system is not the best. And so as you get exposed to the normal toxins of life, your body has a harder time clearing that out. Yikes. Your system is already dealing with a lot of internal stress. It might also be dealing with internal stress if your methylation is off. What if your ability to regulate copper and zinc is off, and all of a sudden you've got high copper excess? That's a neurotoxin to the nervous system, and it makes it so sensitive and so reactive to things like foods, to things like metals, things that aren't even emotional, and yet your body can still be having a trauma response to those things, because the trauma response is anything that overwhelms our body, whether or not it's something emotional or whether it's something physical or biological. And so our biology literally is what determines our resilience for stress and trauma.
Okay, that is interesting. So you're saying you can be in trauma in the trauma response without even really emotionally feeling like you're dealing with trauma.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying, because the trauma response is a state of our nervous system,
Okay.
whatever puts us in that state.
And so if someone's in that state with biologically without feeling the emotional component, would they recognize it again by just feeling an overall sense of overwhelm?
Absolutely. They feel that sense of overwhelm. And we are almost trained to assume that it's something emotional.
Hmm.
And so we look for something in our life that's stressing us out because we feel that sense of overwhelm. And so we miss so much some of these biology reasons for that overwhelm. And we attach it to something or somebody that's in our life and pour them because they get the outlashing of
Yes.
you are the source of all my problems right now. Not realizing that, oh, like it's actually internal that's causing my overwhelm, but we're not trained to think that way. So we usually attach it to something external to us.
Yes. Well, thank you for changing the thoughts. Thank you for bringing this to light because I think we do need to see this. It's everywhere and it can actually make a huge difference for someone listening just to think, "Oh, wait. Okay, I can relate to that. Oh, yes. Okay, maybe." And it opens up to so many more opportunities and for true healing. So, thank you so much for joining us and for actually telling us about this. And can you just tell our listeners here if they want to learn more and where they can find you?
Absolutely. So they can find me over at traumahealingaccelerated.com. And I have a couple of guides there, including one on steps to identify and heal trauma. So even how to help identify if you have this stored trauma pattern in your body. And so that's traumahealingaccelerated.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Meg.